This is the first of 4 videos dealing with our module on religion. And what I would like all of you to be reading is Chapter 6 in the textbook. So let's begin with our learning objectives for this first video. We are going to look at what I call the big trend in human religious practice over the course of the last 100,000 years. What that basically means is that if you look at human religions, we've always had them. Way back in the distant human past, let's say about 200,000 years ago, all the way to the present, one constant is we've always had religion. It changes. And what I do want to talk about then is what's the big trend, the big change in the architecture, if you will, of human religious practice and identity over the course of about the last 100,000 years. Related to that, we are going to look at and examine quite carefully how polytheistic religion lives on in our own modern culture. Polytheistic religion basically means a religion where there is belief in more than one god. So there's both gods and goddesses typically. And there could be dozens or even hundreds of gods and goddesses that form the architecture of that religion. That, of course, is in contrast to monotheistic religions like, let's say, Christianity or Islam, both of which believe in just the one omnipotent God, and one God only, which is an important point of both Christianity and Islam. Thirdly, we'll at least begin a discussion of what I call the typology of world religions, and that just means we're going to build a classification scheme for religions. We're going to organize them by type, hence the word typology. So let's begin with the first of our 3 learning objectives. What is the big trend with regard to human religious practice over the course of our entire time on planet Earth? Well, I need to start out with a big point, and the point is this. All human cultures, whether they're modern or way in the distant past, have had religion. It's basically a constant of all human culture. We've never found, a culture that didn't have some kind of belief system that we could loosely categorize as religion. The big thing that's occurred over the course of about the last 100,000 years is there's been a really interesting shift from polytheism towards monotheism. From, in other words, religions that profess belief in multiple gods to those that are organized around the worship of just one God. And the shift is evidenced primarily, relatively recently, in the shift away from polytheism to, in particular, both Christianity and Islam. Both of which are, I know this is going to sound kind of unusual, but they're both new, insofar as Christianity is only about 2,000 years old, and Islam is about 1,400 years old. So Christianity is actually older than Islam, but what they both have in common is they're basically relatively new, considering that it is now thought that humans have been on planet Earth for about 200,000 years. So, how do I illustrate this idea that the big trend has been from polytheism to monotheism? Well, remember those Angles, Saxons, and Utes that we talked about? Those German tribes, if you will, that left Jutland and went over to the island of Britain, thus eventually giving us the English language? Let's ask ourselves, what religion did they practice? They weren't Christian. They became Christian later on, but when they left Jutland in about 400 or 500 AD and went to Britain, they weren't Christian. Rather, the religion they practiced we could call Nordic polytheism. And Nordic polytheism was a lot like other polytheistic religions in that there wasn't just one god, but there were many. There was, for example, Thor and Odin and a variety of other gods and even goddesses. And so the polytheism of the Anglo-Saxons and Utes, it might be interesting to see if that even in some way shows up in our modern culture. It turns out that it does, and in really surprising and remarkable ways. These are 2 of the Nordic polytheistic gods. On the left is Tyr, and on the right is Odin, who is also sometimes referred to as Wotan. And these two images here, unfortunately, they're modern images representing these older gods from that time period. But of course, we don't have any actual artwork from the, let's say, 2nd century to illustrate this really well. Now, you're probably curious, what do Tyr and Odin have to do with our modern culture? Here in the United States, well, Tyr is the root of the word Tuesday, and Odin, or Wotan, is the root of the word Wednesday. In fact, a lot of the days of the week in the English language reflect polytheistic religious cultural practice, in particular Nordic polytheism. And that would have been the religion practiced by those people who left Jutland in the 5th or 6th century AD. So Tyr becomes Tuesday. It was the day that the Nordic polytheists would have worshipped that particular god. Odin, say it quickly, Odin's Day, Wednesday, Wotan, Wotan's Day, Wednesday. Wednesday was the day devoted to the worship of Wotan. Of course, the same thing is true for Thursday and Friday. Thursday is basically Thor's day, and Friday comes from Freyja, who is a goddess. If you say it quickly, Freyja Day, Freyja's Day, it becomes Friday eventually. And so most, not all, but most of the days of the week in the English language reflect a kind of buried relic polytheism that lives on in our culture even today. Even though none of us really are practicing Nordic polytheism, there is evidence of that polytheistic tradition in our language and a variety of other cultural practices as well. Now, the same thing is true in Spanish. So here we have the days of the week in Espanol. And if you know Spanish, or at least some words in Spanish, you'll recognize these. Lunes, martes, miércoles, and so on. These actually come from Latin. No big surprise, right? Because Spanish descends from Latin. It's related to Latin. And if you look over here, lunes comes from luna, which means the moon. Martis, Mars, Mercury for miércoles, and so on. Guess what? Each one of these is, just like the days of the week in English, a reflection of an older form of religion. In this case, it is Roman polytheism. So, Nordic polytheism lives on in the English language. In Spanish, you have evidence of Roman polytheism, because of course Spanish comes from Spain, which was once a part of the Roman Empire. It would have been Roman polytheism that is likely going to be buried in that particular language. Now, there are so many other ways, but I'm not so sure if I want to give them all to you now. I'll reveal them to you later on, but I'll give you a hint. We celebrate Christmas on December 25th, but guess what? There's no evidence that Jesus was born at any time around December 25th. The reason we celebrate it on December 25th is because the ancient Celtic polytheists of Britain always worshipped on the day of the winter solstice. And so it was really hard after they converted to Christianity to give that up. So the church eventually just moved Christmas to correspond with the winter solstice, which is December 21st or thereabouts. So in a way, Christianity actually co-opted, if you will, a previous polytheistic religious holiday and made it easier then for people to worship the new religion, in this case Christianity, on that particular day. All right, let's move on. We've got just one more thing to do before we finish our first video here. I want to start building what we might call a typology of human religions. That's basically just another way of saying a classification scheme. So let's start out with this. There are some religions that are monotheistic. And what of course that means is all three of these believe in just one God. Interestingly, the three main monotheistic religions all come from the same place. They come from the Middle East, and they're all connected to one another. They're all connected insofar as they profess belief in Abraham as a historical figure. So another way of talking about these three religions is that they are monotheistic, but they're also Abrahamic. They are in order of their founding. In other words, the first one is the oldest, and so on. Judaism, which is the oldest of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, followed by Christianity, which is about 2,000 years old, and then finally the youngest of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions is Islam. All three of them have origins in what Americans typically call the Middle East, and then they grew to include many other parts of the world for a variety of reasons. Now there's another category, and that category is those religions that we are going to call universalizing. All that means is that these religions are open. Anyone can convert. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, or what language you speak, or what your class or social and economic position is. Anyone, any human can convert. And what that typically means is that the universalizing religions travel well. They tend to spread quickly. They tend as well to have great global reach. Once they are created, if you will, and I don't know if that's really the best word to use, but once they have their debut, they tend to move very quickly and with great popularity. There are three main universalizing religions. You'll notice some overlap. Christianity is open to all. Anyone can convert. The same thing is true with regard to Islam, and so is also the case with Buddhism, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But anyone can convert to Buddhism. So these three tend to be the world's largest. They also tend to be the fastest growing, because universalizing religions don't really have any restrictions. Notice that we didn't put Judaism into that category, and that is because Judaism is not universalizing. So it's the only of the monotheistic religions that is not also universalizing. What this means is that it's very difficult to just wake up one day and say, you know what, I think I'm going to convert to Judaism. I'd like to become a Jew. You can do it, but it's much more difficult. There are basically restrictions. It's identified with what we might call an ethnic group. And if you're not a member of that ethnic group, well, why would you want to convert, is the question that people might ask. Now this leads me to one other interesting point. You'll notice here that Buddhism is represented as universalizing but not monotheistic. That's an important point, because Buddhism is not what we might call monotheistic in the conventional way of understanding that word. There really is no God per se in Buddhism, at least in the Western sense of that term. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. Finally, there are the ethnic religions. What we mean by ethnic religions is that they typically are linked to just one ethnic group. They typically don't travel well because they are so deeply connected to just one ethnic group. They are often polytheistic, so they tend to be older. These are ancient, older religions that have been around for a lot longer than any of the three that you have right here, or really in some instances any of the three that you have right here. They go back in time thousands of years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 50 or 100,000 years. So they also don't tend to travel as well because they're often harder to convert to. They are not universalizing, and that's an important point. Hinduism. Hinduism is practiced largely in India or anywhere where Indians have traveled to as immigrants or what have you. Shintoism is practiced in Japan, and pretty much only Japan. Any of the pre-Christian European religions, all of which were polytheistic, were also ethnic because they were associated with just one group. So Greek polytheism, which we sometimes call Greek mythology, Roman polytheism, which we sometimes unfortunately call Roman mythology, and Nordic polytheism, which we saw earlier is very important in modern day English. Native American polytheisms as well were ethnic religions and continue to be. Finally, African polytheisms, just one final example. Again, they still exist today, but in most cases, a lot of these ethnic religions aren't growing very quickly because it's the universalizing religions that tend to grow more quickly. These typically are either stagnant or in decline. We'll talk more about that when we get to our next video.